This is a story that my mother told me and my sisters. Back in the 40s, my dad accepted a job in Atlanta, Georgia, and my parents moved from Chicago, Illinois to Atlanta. For several weeks, they stayed at the Biltmore Hotel in Atlanta while looking for a home. One night, my mother, who was 8 months pregnant at the time, was alone in the room by herself because my dad was on a business trip. She said that she woke up at about 3:35 in the morning and saw a man standing beside the bed and looking at her. The man was well dressed in a suit and smiling at her, but she knew immediately it was a ghost because although she could see him plainly, he was transparent. She could see through him. When she was growing up, the woman who had raised her told her if she ever saw a ghost, say the Lord's Prayer, and it would go away. She pulled the sheet over her head and said the Lord's Prayer, but when she looked again, he was still there. She would close her eyes and open them again, but he did not go away. She fell asleep with the sheets pulled over her head, and the next day she found out at the front desk that a man had died in that room at that exact time she saw the ghost. She described the man she saw to the clerk to ask if she knew him. She felt like the ghost meant her no harm and was there to make himself known and protect her. Her and her sister lived in an old house in Champaign, Illinois, and they both told me that they encountered ghosts several times in that home, and one time they both woke up and saw one standing in their room. So far, I've never seen a ghost, but I'm convinced that they do exist. I've worked as a registered nurse at Henry Male Hospital for many years. There are so many reportings there that I'm not sure I can list them all, but here are a few. The TCU, Transitional Care Unit, is probably the most haunted unit. It serves patients who are not acutely ill, but are also not quite well enough to return home, so consequently, a lot of our elderly patients have spent a great deal of time there, including one that never quite made it home and died on the unit. There have been reports of a walker moving by itself down the hall at night. One room in particular, don't know the numbers, I didn't work there regularly, has a reputation for the call light repeatedly going off at night when it is empty of patients. So much so that the engineering has refused to come fix the bell when the nurses plead to have it silenced. I only worked there one night and had a heavy fire door slowly swing open in front of me and another nurse, as if someone was going into the room. No windows or doors were open as they were bolted shut, and the door is extremely heavy. The other nurse, terrified, screamed at me, "Close the door, close the door." That same night, I had a female patient who had been in her room for a few months and said she felt like she was going batty and that she was so thankful for her TV. Shortly after, it went to static, and I couldn't turn it off with the remote, nor by pushing the power on and off button on the set itself, and finally had to get a chair to flat out pull out the cord from the outlet that was situated near the ceiling. One night, one of the nurses was working a very late shift at night, and she went to go grab a mop after she spilled her drink all over the lobby floor. She went down to the storage area where she knew nobody was there at the time. As she opened the door to the storage closet, in the darkness, she swore she saw what looked to be the face of an elderly woman from the other side of the room, and two glowing eyes, barely lit. It was all just bright enough to be seen with the naked eye. She immediately turned on the light and ran all the way back. She refused to go down there the rest of her time working there, and even change careers. It was that devastating to her. On the medical surgical unit too, there are ghosts up and down the whole hallway. The end opposite the nurse's station is especially bad. Rooms 148, 146, and 142 are the worst. Oftentimes, patients who are dying are put in these rooms, and shortly before they do die, patients often report seeing a little blonde girl in their room at night. They either ask the nurses to get her out, or at the very least, ask who she is. I had an aide one night open up a utility locker at the same end and saw the girl. She was crouched behind a walker, scared, looking up at her. Sometimes machines won't work in those rooms, even if you trade them in several times from the supply department with different ones. They suddenly will start working again. Myself and another nurse witnessed shadow people, at the same time, walk past the nurse's station window while the computers and lights dimmed simultaneously. He saw the same night, one shadow person standing in a doorway, just staring at him. He looked up and asked yes, thinking it was a nurse aide willing to ask him a question, only to realize it wasn't an aide. Aides have seen patients that weren't there earlier in the evening, suddenly lying in a bed, and thinking it was a new admission, brought the vital signs machine back in to take their vitals, only to have the patient gone, and the bed still made. Med-Surg 1 is next to Med-Surg 2, and though it isn't as bad as 2, I've had a patient complain that she felt little kids poking at her and pulling her gown all evening. Med-Surg 1 was a pediatric unit for 1 year when the hospital was first built, but was shut down as it wasn't financially sustainable. The elevators near the cafeteria that lead down to the morgue are just plain creepy at night. I've known people that have had them slam open and shut closed several times before finally shutting and going down to the morgue. I personally would have had them open for me almost 100% of the time if I was pushing a gurney and didn't have a free hand to hit the button, saying thanks to stay on whatever's good side. Besides, it is kinda nice, except for the creepy part. These are only a few of the stories off the top of my head. I myself have only worked on a few of the units, so I'm sure there are many more. I made a dark joke one day to one of the old-time doctors that the hospital was built in an old Indian burial ground, as it has so much activity there. And he responded that indeed it is. Who knows if he is right, but all of Santa Clarita is that Indian tribe situated throughout the valley for thousands of years. In fact, we were one of the main trading hubs, if not the main trading hub, from tribes spanning down into Mexico, all the way up to Canada. I can't validate the Indian burial ground part, but the stories I related to you here, I either experienced myself or spoke with the Asian person firsthand, who had just experienced something themselves, except for TCU, but there again, I used first-hand accounts. I grew up in the great state of Utah. As many know, this state has a rich and glorified history of Native Americans who have lived on the North American soil for generations. I'm going to tell you about my experiences with a ghostly apparition, a series of unusual chants I heard while camping at the famous Uneta National Forest, and even a ghost dog. The climate of Utah is more diverse than you would think. We have areas of lush vegetation, forests, and other greener parts of the state in the north, and in the south, we have dry, barren deserts. This first story is about what my grandfather witnessed when he was driving late at night on the road. This was in St. George, Utah. My grandfather was always a very straight-laced person. Never drank, never smoked, always got enough sleep, and had a good head on his shoulders. The reason why I'm mentioning this is to explain what he saw that night. He was driving late at night, where there were barely any cars on the road. In fact, it seemed like he was the only one driving on this road. It was pitch black, and the only visibility he had was from his headlights that shine across the road. He had been driving on the same road for about 15 minutes, a road that was completely isolated in the middle of nowhere. Out of nowhere, he saw what looked to be a Native American man standing in the middle of the road from the distance. He slowed down immediately after he saw this, fearing he would hit the man. As he got closer, the Native American man disappeared. Now, he knew it wasn't his imagination. The man looked real to him, at least from afar. His mind wasn't playing tricks on him, and he swore to this day he wasn't tired. He knew what he saw. My grandfather was so floored by the whole event, he had to pause for a second and pull off to the side of the road. Where he stopped was where he saw the man. There was absolutely nothing and no one there. No homes in the area, just desert and a long winding road at night. There was no way he could explain it. This was also in the 1960s, and St. George was way smaller than it is now, a population around 5,000. My grandpa's still alive, in his 90s, and he hasn't given up on the authenticity of his story. He swears he saw a real ghost, and I'm convinced he will take his story to his grave. As for my experience, my family went camping in the Uinta National Forest, where we set up a tent deep in the woods. I remember it was a fantastic time, just me, my dad, and my brother. We heard nothing but the sounds of nature, and were truly enjoying our time alone from civilization. It was getting later in the night, and so we set up a campfire. It might have been around 11 p.m. at night, when my brother, my dad, and I all heard what sounded like a ghostly chant, almost sounding like a group of Native Americans. It sounded almost as if the chants were as low as gorillas chanting to us, which was unusual, because gorillas definitely don't live in Utah, and I couldn't think of an animal that could make such a deep voice. And not only that, but multiple voices chanting at once. What made it so eerie was that it wasn't frantic. The chants had a peacefulness to it. But of course, we were all freaked out. It was definitely not a comforting chant, but it wasn't boisterous. So anyway, my dad told me and my brother to get into the tent to sleep at night, because my dad was genuinely concerned that maybe there were dangerous people out there trying to scare us. The chants only lasted for about a minute, and it eventually went dead silent, and we never heard it again. I think my dad must have waited outside the tent with the campfire for an hour or two, just to make sure everything was okay. He eventually went back into the tent himself. However, that night of bizarre events were far from being over. As we were sleeping, my dad said that he was awakened by the sound of rustling leaves. He woke up and noticed from the inside of his tent a shadow on the other side, as in when you are in a tent and you see someone or something shadow move by. He immediately jumped out of the tent to investigate, but there was nobody there. He thought nothing of it, and then went back to bed. On the third night after camping, we went to bed as usual, and this time, I experienced the same occurrence. Instead of it being a shadow of what my dad thought was a person, it seemed to be of a creature. My guess was a dog, because the shadow shape looked to be of that. It could have been a bear, because the shadow was small from seeing it move from inside of the tent. I immediately woke my dad up, and he went out. And again, nothing. Not sure what to make of all these events, but I'm certain there's more than meets the eye. I had a strange thing happen to me once when I was in the Philippines visiting family. The home I stayed in was part of a group of 3 homes around a central courtyard and a shared restroom and shower facility with the other 2 houses. My family showed me around the place the day I arrived, and then told me to be careful when going outside at night because there was a ghost that haunted the area. My reaction, of course, was yeah, right, because I just knew they were messing with me. My 3rd night there, I wasn't feeling well and needed to go to the restroom a lot more than usual. Don't drink the water in the Philippines, by the way. So I ended up going out to the restroom facility late at night. The restroom facility was on the far side of the courtyard from the house I was staying in, and around the side of one of the other houses, and it was very dark because the lights were out in all of the houses, and the nearest street light was pretty far away. I was on my way back from the restroom, and just as I walked into the courtyard, what felt like a force grabbed me from behind. It was such an odd feeling, like a major resistance pushing me back, almost like going against gravity. To clarify, I don't mean literally. It was just an overwhelming pressure, but I could feel the energy around me so strongly, it's hard to explain exactly. I ended up turning around and going in the opposite direction to an empty field that bordered the courtyard, because something was almost pulling me in that direction, like there were hands on my body. I say something because it felt like a force grabbing me on my arms. This force seemed to disappear when I got closer to the field. I shifted my body around, and all of a sudden, I saw this solid black human shape from a few feet away, not moving. Just a black mass silhouette that I could identify as a human, if that makes sense. I took off running towards the home and looking over my shoulder again, and the black shadow was gone. I burst into the home, and apparently I screamed. I don't remember even doing it, but I'm not surprised, and I'm not ashamed, because people were coming out of their bedrooms to see what was going on. I told everyone what happened, and they all took it in stride. One cousin even said, "Oh yeah, that happens." I was really freaked out, and didn't sleep the rest of that night, and I didn't go out at night alone. The rest of the time I was there. I did some reading and asked some questions since then, and the answer I got most often was that I was an evil spirit. From what I've read and been told, these are paranormal entities that are angry, evil, and seek to harm people. Sometimes they used to be human, but others were never human. When I asked what they were if they weren't human, I hear the word demon tossed around quite often. Regardless, there are many stories similar to mine where a black shadow or human shape has grabbed a person, and I just wanted to tell you about my experience. Maybe someone else has had this kind of experience as well. I grew up in a hip stone-roof farmhouse that used to belong to my grandparents. We lived in a German-American neighborhood, and many farmhouses had a quaint old country sensibility, with the main living space a flight of stairs up from the entrance. Like many older homes, ours was large in size, but broken up into small rooms. One such room was my grandmother's old pantry, just off the kitchen. My parents had turned half of it into a small home office, with a desk for the telephone, back in the day of one telephone per household, next to a window that looked out into our backyard. When I was very small, I used to enjoy looking out of our windows at night, making wishes on stars, watching sparkling waves of snow fall through the glow of our yard light, waiting for my dad to come in from his evening milking chores in the barn, occasionally finding surprises, like the summer evening that a huge green Luna moth came to rest on the window of the door. This small, close telephone room frightened me, but I enjoyed the backyard evening view, so I'd bravely venture into the room, crawl up into the chair next to the window, and look outside. One evening, I had a desire to look out the telephone room window. As usual, I was somewhat apprehensive about entering the little room, but my curiosity overcame my anxiety. I took a deep breath and prepared to step over the threshold from the warm light of the kitchen into the darkness. As I did, I looked into the window, and there I saw, staring right back at me, the wizened face of an old man, hovering in midair. He was partially bald and had a long handlebar mustache, and he had a furious, even hateful expression. I remember screaming in terror and running outside into the arms of my perplexed mother, crying that a scary old man was floating outside. I remember my mother wondering if I'd seen a frightening program on television and had let my imagination run away with me. I was understandably afraid to venture into that room for a while. The fear and the memory of that night faded away. To the extent that I remembered my experience at all, I tended to explain it in terms of a vivid imagination, and I never had another experience like that in that room. Many years later, when I was a teen, I was sitting at the dinner table with my parents as they were reminiscing about their childhoods, their earliest memories. My father said that one of his earliest memories was of his father's original home, a small wooden home that once stood a short distance away from our farmhouse. He said that he remembered his grandfather dying and being laid out in the parlor of that little home, as was a common occurrence in that rural neighborhood, even in the 20s. "What do you remember about your grandfather?" my mother asked. "He was an old man, mean and strict. We kids were afraid of him. He didn't have a lot of hair, but he did have one of those old-fashioned handlebar mustaches," Dad replied. I felt the hair rise in the back of my neck as I suddenly remembered that vision of my early childhood. My name is Lena, and I'm from Malta. I was looking at your site because I have a ghost story I wanted to share with you. About 8 years ago, I was living with my ex-boyfriend, who had recently changed the house at the time. The home was about 50 years old, and as we were fast asleep, maybe it was between 2:30 and 3 in the morning, I began to slightly wake up, because although I was not fully awake in my head, I was hearing some noises like I had a metal bucket in my yard, which was near the bedroom, like someone was dragging it. Then the wardrobe doors began like someone was shutting and opening them. The wardrobe was by the wall on the side where I was sleeping. I want to remind you that by then, I was still not fully awake. And then I could hear near my ear like people talking. Remember, I was half awake until all of a sudden, I was fully awake, and at the end of the bed, I saw 2 figures of 2 men, and although it was dark in the room, I saw them clearly. When I saw this, I was in awe, and I rose on my ankles, and these 2 figures, as I already told you, were of 2 men. One was young, and the other was older, and they were wearing white robes, and on their heads they had these white turbans, and they had no feet. They half turned and looked at me, and then they went forward like in a slow motion, and began to fade, until they vanished through the wall. I was not frightened at all. I swear that I was fully awake when I saw them, and in the morning, I told my ex-boyfriend, who did not see nothing, because only me they had woken up, and he didn't believe me, but I know for sure that it happened. To this day, I don't know who they were. Excuse me for my poor English. Throughout the years, I've had many experiences with things I've never been able to explain. I'll share some of them here. This is the first one I have a memory of. When I was very small, about 5 years old, we lived with my grandmother while our house was being built. I always felt warm and protected in that home. I never was afraid. Even though my room was at the top of very narrow stairs and was under the eaves of the attic, I never feared anything in that room. One night, there was a terrible thunderstorm, and I remember dreaming that there was a fire under my parents' bed. I woke up screaming and ran into their room. I kept telling my father that there was a fire under the bed. They did their best to explain that it was only a nightmare and that there was no fire. My father even got out of bed, pulled up the covers, looked under the bed, and promised that there was no fire. I eventually fell back to sleep in the bed with them. An hour or so later, I had the dream again, but the fire was bigger. I started screaming again and woke my parents. This time, however, there was the distinct smell of burning wiring, and indeed, the floorboards under the bed had started to smolder. Luckily for all of us, my father was able to shut off the electricity and stop the fire before it truly started. The only damage was replacing some wiring and a few floorboards. From that point on, though, my parents always listened to me when I had an unusual dream or saw something out of the ordinary. This, though, was the scariest thing my parents witnessed when I just turned 5 years old. We always had the attic stairs open. Apparently, I'd sneaked into our attic for multiple days, and when my parents would catch me playing in the attic, they would ask me why I kept going up there. I would tell them that the old man in the attic was lonely, and he wanted a friend, so I continued to talk to him to keep him company. This clearly startled my parents, and after the fire incident and the dreams that I had, they wanted to get to the bottom of this. They continuously asked me, "Where is this man?" So I would point at the corner in the attic and say, "He's staring at you. He's very mad you ignored him." It was at this point we had a priest come bless the home because it really seemed like a massive negative energy was in the home. I even remember getting a witch psychic to come and investigate, to talk to whoever the man was and get an idea. So we did get a spirit session, and she talked with the spirit. The psychic said she felt a man named Jim was burned to death in this home. With what I said about having dreams of the home burning, it was a man in his early 60s. So we got a spirit box, and the psychic asked if Jim was there. He confirmed and said fire truck 4 or 5 times, then smoke, and I was smoked. The psychic then asked the spirit if it died a bad death, and the spirit box said, "Are you kidding?" She asked again. He said yes. You can't make this stuff up. If you ever played with a spirit box before, you know that spirits communicate with their energy to create statements through radio frequencies and whatnot. What we were able to discern was that there was probably a fire in this home, and that this old man was caught in it. We don't know much aside from that, but this whole experience was spooky. This was back in 2009. And this is just a world of Phantom of Darkness narrations. Hope you comment and helps the algorithm, and subscribe and share this video. Love you guys.